Hi there, I'm Tracy Smith, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Her silhouette alone is a symbol of revolution. Activist, professor, and writer Angela Davis sat down with our Lilia Luciano.
Miss Davis entered the courtroom, turned and gave a black power salute to the gallery.
Davis was charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. She faced the death penalty. An all-white jury delivered its verdict on June 4th, 1972.
The tension was electric, waiting for the clerk to read the verdicts. The first charge was murder, not guilty.
She was acquitted on all counts.
Not guilty.
It was not until that moment that I realized that I had a future ahead of me.
She has since dedicated her life to the issue of prisons, not reforming them, but abolishing them.
Well, I've really tried to learn from history. So if someone made the argument that abolition is too strong a term, I would remind people that during the era of slavery, there were those who made the very same argument.
There's more from their conversation coming up a little later in the show.
What is it like to talk to students today who know the icon that you are? What do they ask you? What are they curious about?
Well, oftentimes when I teach on the first day of class, students are a bit awestruck, but very rapidly they come to recognize that it is about doing the intellectual work, not about me. Of course, I'm personally quite surprised that knowledge about the work that we did 50 years ago still circulates today. And I tend to be shocked when young people know who I am, although I'm aware of the fact that my image is circulated in popular culture, in hip hop, in visual images, and so forth. But it still is sort of amazing that 50 years after my case, people still are aware of the movement that achieved my freedom.
Then we head out west for a history lesson on the heart and soul of surfboards.
I've had boards that I've tried to duplicate for myself, and each board has its own characteristics.
It's like snowflakes, no two are alike when they're
agree.
hand-shaped.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Don't get me wrong, you can buy a machine-made board too, like the one I'm paddling here. They're often cheaper and easier to ride. But they'll never have that certain something that a shaper puts into a board when they're making one just for you. I'm going to ask you a hippy-dippy question now. Do these boards speak to you?
That's a common question. Yeah, I guess I do feel like there's a little more soul in a hand-shaped board.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. Angela Davis has been advocating against oppression, white supremacy, and police violence for more than 5 decades. In conversation, Lilia Luciano spoke with her about the fight for equality then and now.
After more than 50 years, she's still instantly recognizable worldwide as the face of revolution.
How does the woman, Professor Angela Davis, relate to those posters?
I felt really uncomfortable, and that is because I think I was expecting to find myself in those images.
But Angela Davis has come to terms with her image.
Now I look at them and I see all of the millions of people who came together to participate in a struggle.
Racism is indeed the key problem faced by the people of the country, and the threat of fascism is growing.
For half a century, Angela Davis has been sounding alarms.
There is a proliferation of police assaults on the Black community all over the country.
Alarms that are still going off today.
Those who still defend the supremacy of white male heteropatriarchy had better watch out.
Of course, I love being a revolutionary, and I love being radical. It's important to be radical.
The roots of that radicalism can be traced to her upbringing in Birmingham, Alabama.
I grew up in a world that was entirely organized according to the dictates of white supremacy.
I understand you grew up in a street that was known as Dynamite Hill because of the amount of terrorist bombings when black families moved into that community.
My very first memories are the sounds of dynamite. And then also the fear of watching my father bring his gun out when we thought that the Ku Klux Klan might be assaulting our home.
Miss Davis was a Phi Beta Kappa at Brandeis University in Boston. She did graduate work in Germany and San Diego.
What does Glenn mean when he talks about the socialization of production?
By the age of 26, Davis was an assistant professor of philosophy at UCLA. She had joined the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party, and that made her a target of California Governor Ronald Reagan.
When the Regents finally decided to fire me, I said that it was obvious that there was racism involved.
The very first press conference I held in the immediate aftermath of my firing at UCLA, I think my eyes were wide open and my knees were shaking under the table. And today people look at that and they say, oh, you were so much more militant then. I said, no, I was just afraid.
Gunfire came from automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols.
A year later, a bloody courthouse siege brought her worldwide attention, though she wasn't even there. An attempt to free the so-called Soledad brothers, a group of inmates accused of killing a prison guard, ended in a shootout.
When it was over, Judge Haley was dead. 2 of the inmates were dead.
The guns used in the attack were traced to Davis. She said she had bought them for her security team after getting death threats. And she went into hiding.
The FBI has put black militant Angela Davis on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives.
Why did you run?
I didn't have a choice. All of my comrades and friends and I were aware of the ways in which people who were trying to turn themselves into the police had been killed.
The FBI caught up with her at a hotel in Manhattan. She was put at times in solitary confinement, while around the world, protesters called for her release. Then she was extradited to California.
Miss Davis entered the courtroom, turned and gave a black power salute to the gallery.
Davis was charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. She faced the death penalty.
Outside, there were 1,000 of Miss Davis supporters shouting, "Free Angela." They've pledged to be here as long as she's in court.
The moment was a long time coming. The jury had deliberated for 13 hours.
An all-white jury delivered its verdict on June 4th, 1972.
The tension was electric, waiting for the clerk to read the verdicts. The first charge was murder, not guilty.
She was acquitted on all counts.
Not guilty.
It was not until that moment that I realized that I had a future ahead of me.
I would simply like to thank all of you who struggled so long and so hard for my freedom.
Davis set off on a tour of the U.S. as well as the Eastern Bloc in Soviet Union.
Bring greetings from the Communist Party to the Soviet people.
She would leave the party 20 years later.
When I left the Communist Party, I made it very clear that although I may no longer be a communist with a capital C, I remain a communist with a small c. Historical experiments don't necessarily produce what we want them to.
The 16 months in jail before her acquittal had given Davis a new commitment.
I have come to think about my incarceration as a gift, witnessing the ways in which other women in prison were being treated. That really consolidated what I think has been my vocation.
She has since dedicated her life to the issue of prisons, not reforming them, but abolishing them.
There are words like defund or abolish. At the same time that they elevate a cause, they also create such division. Why not advocate for reform?
Well, I've really tried to learn from history. So if someone made the argument that abolition is too strong a term, I would remind people that during the era of slavery, there were those who made the very same argument.
The United States has 4% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's prisoners. 38% of the U.S. prison population is Black.
What does a world post-prison look like?
My question would be, what would a world have to look like in order not to require the persistent interventions of police and imprisonment? We need better education. We would need a better healthcare system. We would need a better world. So abolition urges us to expand and make more capacious our very vision.
Angela Davis is still writing, still teaching. After 50 years of fighting the same fights, it may seem the more things change, the more the causes remain the same. But Angela Davis is still energized and optimistic.
There are so many issues that you fought against that seem current. You were fighting against them 50 years ago. How do you not lose hope?
No change is possible without hope. No movement is possible without hope.
We have to march on with the unshakable confidence that we will win our fight for a new society, our fight for a society where freedom, justice, equality, abundance, dignity, and happiness belongs to all.
More exclusive excerpts from Lilia Luciano's chat with Angela Davis coming up a little later in the show. But up next, Surf's Up. From an exclusive sport of Hawaiian royalty to today's permanent place in pop culture cool, we learned that surfing has come a long way.
Nope, we're not in Kansas anymore. Surfing off the California coast is as popular as it's ever been. From the party wave riders at Malibu to the folks chilling at Doheny, where you can sit for hours in the lineup, just waiting for the right wave.
And for that, you need just the right board. This one is big and wide, made out of foam. It's great for surfing little waves like this. In fact, just about anyone could ride it. But in surfing, it wasn't always that way.
Surfing was once a sport reserved for Hawaiian royalty, who rode the waves on boards of solid wood that were long, narrow, and majestically heavy.
It's 140 pounds.
140 pounds? So how did they even get it out to the beach?
If you're royalty, they carry it for you.
Patty Paniccia used to surf for a living, one of the few female pro surfers back in the 1970s, when the surfing world was mostly a boys' club. Here she was at a contest in Hawaii, cranking a perfect bottom turn on a big wave. And, well, she had to be a pretty good swimmer, too.
This board would be about the 1940s. It's the first
Today, she's a trustee of the Surfing Heritage and Culture Center.
It's got some mahogany
in San Clemente.
It's got a little more shape than the older ones, right?
Yes, it does.
And this looks like it's heavy, too.
Oh, it's not as heavy. I think this is about 55 pounds.
Still.
Yeah.
By the late 50s, boards got shorter and lighter.
Let's go!
And surfing had taken its place in the popular culture. Surfboard maker Hobie Alter, who started making boards with lightweight balsa wood, switched to polyurethane foam and helped take the sport to the next level. Hobie's Dana Point, California store is still thriving, and his namesake Hobie surfboards are still made the old school way. Shaper Gary Larson starts with a blank piece of foam and custom carves it for a surfer's specific needs. He'll angle the sides or rails to help a board stay put on a steep wave face, sharpen the nose for high-performance turns, or carve a wider tail for stability.
These are stringers, so these are wood.
Some boards have thin strips of wood, called stringers, running down the middle for added stiffness and style. This model runs around $1,800, but each surfboard is different.
I've had boards that I've tried to duplicate for myself, and each board has its own characteristics.
It's like snowflakes, no two are alike when they're
agree.
hand-shaped.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Don't get me wrong, you can buy a machine-made board too, like the one I'm paddling here. They're often cheaper and easier to ride. But they'll never have that certain something that a shaper puts into a board when they're making one just for you.
I'm going to ask you a hippy-dippy question now. Do these boards speak to you?
That's a common question. Yeah, I guess I do feel like There's a little more soul in a hand-shaped board.
Of course, no matter how good a surfboard's design, it's only as good as the surfer and the waves that day. And every one of those is different too.
I've since recognized that although we did not win the revolution we thought we were fighting for, our work occasioned radical change.
More from Angela Davis up next.
Also a new collective consciousness.
Welcome back. As promised, here's more from Lilia Luciano and Angela Davis.
What is it like to talk to students today who know the icon that you are? What do they ask you? What are they curious about?
Well, oftentimes when I teach on the first day of class, students are a bit awestruck, but very rapidly they come to recognize that it is about doing the intellectual work, not about me. Of course, I'm personally quite surprised that knowledge about the work that we did 50 years ago still circulates today. And I tend to be shocked when young people know who I am, although I'm aware of the fact that my image is circulated in popular culture, in hip hop, in visual images, and so forth. But it still is sort of amazing that 50 years after my case, people still are aware of the movement that achieved my freedom. And let me say that this is what I always emphasize. I don't like to focus attention on myself as individual. When I do interviews such as this, it's not so much to highlight me and the work that I've done. It's about shedding light on movements and possibilities and worlds to come.
Speaking with you today, I think about the not guilty, not guilty, not guilty verdicts in your case. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but also think about the guilty, guilty, guilty verdicts in the murder of George Floyd and how that bookends 50 years of history. Mm-hmm. What were your emotions then? How does this time compare to now? What did you think about? And did you go back to how justice looked like for you versus some sort of justice for George Floyd?
Well, I often find myself thinking about whether it was possible to imagine this moment. And I don't think it was. I don't think we had the collective capacity to, I would say, imagine the success to a certain extent of the work that we were doing. But as I'm constantly awed by the young activists and by the work that is being done today and by the fact that the discourse of abolition, which is something that I have embraced for many, many decades, is now a part of public conversation. I don't think I could have ever imagined that moment. But at the same time, I understand that it was enabled precisely by the organizing of people whose names are lost to history. I've said to others and to myself over the years that we should not be entirely pessimistic when we don't seem to be achieving our goals. In the final analysis, that work will matter. We don't necessarily know how it will manifest itself, but certainly during this current era, it could not have been imagined that a global pandemic would provide the backdrop for the emergence of a collective consciousness regarding structural racism in relation to the prison, in relation to the police.
Did you, when you were younger, did you expect that it would take 50 years for this racial reckoning to happen?
Oh, no. I mean, I said it would have been hard to imagine this moment. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, we expected that the revolution would arrive tomorrow. I mean, there was an urgency about the work that we did in the mid to late 60s, the early 70s, that was mirrored by events unfolding in other parts of the world. Latin America, in Africa, there were revolutionary developments that we wanted to be a part of, and we associated ourselves with that radical internationalism. And so on the one hand, we believed that the revolution was about to manifest itself in ways that it manifested itself in African liberation movement, the decolonization process, the Cuban Revolution, for example. But of course, I've since recognized that although we did not win the revolution we thought we were fighting for, our work occasioned radical change and produced new possibilities and also a new collective consciousness. Because I think that the persistence and struggling for Black freedom also helped to produce new movements. Not only new movements in communities of color, Latinx communities, indigenous communities, et cetera, but also the women's movement, the movement against gender violence, the trans movement. And I'm so proud to be associated with this movement because I think that it has helped spawn new possibilities, new ways of imagining the future.
I'm Tracy Smith. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you here next time on Here Comes the Sun.